Hi everyone, in this video of Accelerated Chess Dragon, we're going to be looking at a game played between Jose Raul Capablanca and Frank James Marshall. This was played in the 1918 Manhattan Chess Club International Tournament in New York City in the United States, and without further ado, let's look at this game. Capablanca on the white end starts with the move e4, and we have e5 by Marshall, knight f3, and now knight c6. So we have the Ruy Lopez now, and the Morphy defense. And after knight f6, castles, bishop e7, just normal development, rook e1. And now, in the Ruy Lopez, once you defend the e4 pawn, whether it be with rook e1 or d3, usually your next plan is to play bishop takes c6, capture the e5 pawn, and you're just simply up a pawn as white. So Marshall prevents that from Capablanca by playing b5, and this is perhaps centuries-old theory. Here, Marshall castles before going d6 and knight a5 to win the bishop on b3. So now c3 and now d5. And this is the Marshall attack. And this is actually the first time the Marshall attack has ever been played. So here, Capablanca plays e takes d5. This is correct. Knight takes d5, and now knight takes e5 is played. So removing the e5 pawn, and seemingly Capablanca wins a pawn, but it's not over yet. Knight takes e5, rook takes e5, and now knight to f6. Usually, nowadays, you'll see the move c6 being played, and then bishop to f6, or bishop to d6, kicking the rook away. But in those days, it was knight f6. So after knight f6, Capablanca just brings the rook back to e1. And this is a correct decision, as you do not want to be in the line of fire of this bishop, because let's say you were to keep this rook on e5. After d4, there are simply ideas like bishop to d6, and after something like rook e1, best is c5, but there are also some ideas like bishop takes h2 check, the Greek gift sacrifice, and Capablanca just doesn't want to get into complications like that, so he decides not to leave his rook there. Instead, he goes rook to e1. Now after bishop d6, before Marshall can get any ideas of going for a Greek gift sacrifice, Capablanca saves the pawn. So now, what are you going to play here as Marshall? You're down a pawn, and if you don't do something quick, Capablanca can easily consolidate, and he can capitalize on what you have just did. So, what are you going to play here as Marshall? I'll give you some time to think about it. Okay, so the move Marshall played in the game was actually knight g4, and he's going all out for an attack. Of course, he is just down a whole pawn, and if he doesn't do anything quick, then he's going to lose the game, because Capablanca can consolidate, and what does Marshall have? Nothing for Capablanca's extra pawn. So, he has to act fast. After knight g4, Capablanca doesn't capture the knight on g4, and he's correct when he does that, because if Capablanca had captured this knight on g4, then there's queen h4, and the idea is to try infiltrating with the queen, but also activating this bishop, with moves like bishop captures on g4, mainly trying to stop this king from running away to somewhere like e2. After queen h4 is played, best is to go rook to e4. Now, what does this move try to do? Well, it simply just tries to make sure that this pawn is defended, and that Capablanca can escape with the king. Now, after rook to e4 is played, queen h2 check is going to be played by Marshall. Now, after king to f1, queen to h1 check. And now after king to e2, what do you play here? That's correct. You go bishop takes g4 check. And this position is just going to get out of control for Capablanca. And, well, if you go f3, then there's simply queen g2 check, and that goes into Marshall's favor. So Capablanca must do something like rook takes g4. Eliminating the bishop, yes, but now rook ae8 check. And this is where the trouble really starts to happen. King d3, and now rook e1. And Capablanca is really in trouble, because his queen is hit, and if he moves the queen, then most likely he's going to lose the bishop. Best place to move the queen would be to f3, but after simply moves like queen f1 check, Capablanca's king is on the run, and it's most likely going to get caught. Because if you play something like king d4, then there's a very nice tactic that Marshall can play that just traps Capablanca's king straight dead in the center. And what is that move, you might be asking? Well, it's rook to e5. And after this, what does Capablanca do? He's being threatened with the move c5, and that is checkmate. It's a pretty big threat. And if you try to escape with something like c4, then c5 check nonetheless. Now, after something like king to c3, just queen takes c1 check. And yes, Marshall is down a piece. But look at Capablanca's king, and look at these pieces on the queen side. If you compare the pieces, you can obviously see a big difference. Capablanca's pieces are very passive. Marshall's pieces are all very active. So the question is, for Capablanca, how do you activate the pieces? Bishop c2 will be played, yes. Okay, you safeguard the material. But after something like rook e6, all you need to do is just go bishop e5, and, well, you're winning here as Marshall. And if Capablanca had captured this knight, which he didn't in the game, then Marshall would have just gotten a tremendous advantage, and Capablanca would just be running for his life. So queen f3 instead. Capablanca is eyeing this rook, but his attention is not completely towards the rook. It's mainly to try guarding the king's position. Queen h4. Marshall is giving up the rook, and it's important why you see not to capture the rook. It's because queen takes f2 check, and that's a simple win. After king h1, just queen takes e1, this is checkmate. So you can't capture the rook. You need to guard the f2 pawn. So Capablanca plays the move d4. And this is actually the correct move, because d4 is played with the intention of trying to obviously free up the pieces. I mean, in the previous variation, we saw that none of Capablanca's pieces were being active. So d4 is definitely an improvement on that. So after d4 is played, what do you think Marshall should do here? Marshall should go for this bishop h2 check move. And now, after the move king to h1, just knight takes f2 check. King takes h2, and now knight goes back to g4 check. Queen is attacking rook, king must go back to the first rank, and when you combine all of this together, you get that Capablanca is going to be down material, and he has nothing he can do against it. Obviously, trying to give up the queen for material does kind of work, but it would just be at the cost of lots of material. So this doesn't look like a very good position for Capablanca. Now, of course, you don't have to go king to h1. You could also go king to f1. But if king to f1 is played, then the bishop just retreats all the way back. This is a threat now, knight h2. And maybe even, if Capablanca isn't careful, this could even be a threat, to divert the queen's attention not to the f2 pawn, but to this bishop on b7. Of course, at the moment, this doesn't work because the knight on g4 would be hanging, but ideas like that can happen, and you must be aware here if you are Capablanca. Now, after bishop d6, there are too many threats to deal with, and Marshall would definitely get an advantage. Let's say bishop to f4, guarding against the threats. Now, like, Marshall has bishop to b7 here, and, well, yes, he doesn't exactly win any material, because after queen g4, he can take, and now he wins the bishop. But still, Marshall has the bishop pair. And even if he's not going to win with a queen middle game, he has chances of actually converting very well in the endgame. This is something you should know in chess. When you're going to attack your opponent, you're not primarily doing it to win the game. Most likely, you're going to do it to just win material. I know that sounds very strange, but it's true. So, after bishop takes f4, Marshall has 6 pawns. Capablanca does have 7 pawns. But if you look at the structure of Capablanca's pawns, there's a very huge difference. And also, how does this knight really get activated? You would have to go to a3 and then to c2 and then maybe to e3, which takes a bit of time, and in that meantime, Marshall can easily activate his pieces very efficiently. So, king to f1 or king to h1 would definitely not lead to a very good position. So bishop h2 check definitely could have been played by Marshall. Instead, Marshall decided to go for the move knight takes f2. And it has an idea, which is that if Capablanca is going to capture the knight with queen takes f2, then you just simply go bishop to h2 check. And now if the king goes to f1, then you go bishop to g3. King going to h1 would just allow queen takes f2, and same with king takes h2. It's important why you don't go bishop to g3 immediately, and that's because there's a very nice tactic that Capablanca can use that easily wins the game. And what is that tactic? Well, I'll leave that up to you. Okay, so the solution is to just take the pawn on f7 with the queen, not the bishop. And there's a huge difference why it's better with the queen and not the bishop. The bishop is going to be pinning this rook to the king on g8. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, obviously, if you go king to h8, you lose the rook, and that's checkmate. So rook takes f7 is forced. But now, the rook comes all the way back to e8. There's nothing that you can use to block the check because this rook on f7 is being pinned by the bishop on b3. And this is something that you should be aware of and why you should not go bishop g3 immediately, but instead interpose this check, and then after the king goes to f1, now go bishop g3. Because now if you try that same technique, after rook takes f7, this comes with check. So you do not have time to go rook e8 and check. So after something like bishop f7, I mean, Marshall can just take the bishop and look at this. Just extra material and very active material. That is something that Marshall has that Capablanca doesn't. And it's the reason why Marshall would just go on to win this game with no trouble at all. So, you cannot play the move queen takes f2. So instead, what does Capablanca do? I mean, now Marshall is threatening moves like knight takes h3 check, and first of all, the king's position would be very exposed. But not only that, I mean, now Capablanca's rook is also exposed to this queen on h4. So, Capablanca plays the move, rook to e2. He saves his rook from any danger. And now you might be asking me, why doesn't Capablanca just go queen takes f7 check? Well, because after all of this, Marshall can just defend with bishop f8. It's important why the bishop goes back to f8. In the previous variation, the bishop wouldn't be able to block the check. In this case, it can. So that's why it's important to know the difference. So, queen f7 doesn't work, so instead rook to e2. Capablanca hopes to at least defend the position a bit more. Now, after rook to e2, what does Marshall do? He goes for the move bishop to g4. And is that completely accurate? Well, bishop takes h3 definitely would have been a bit better, because if here you play the move queen takes f2, then there's just the move bishop g3. And what does this move do? Well, it tries to bring in this bishop into the game, and it also is going to play this move bishop g4, and then you just bring the queen down the board and it's mate. Now, why can you not try this tactic again? Well, because now this rook is guarding the 8th rank. So Marshall doesn't have to fear. Capablanca, though, does. And this is just going to be a losing position for Capablanca. And if you do not capture the knight on f2 with the queen, and if you instead capture with the rook, for instance, then still the same thing, bishop g4, and, well, you're losing here as Capablanca. Just too many threats that Marshall has towards your king. So, after bishop h3, it's best to just take the bishop with g takes h3, but after knight takes h3, let's say king to f1, let's say now bishop to f4, you see how maybe there are chances for Capablanca to survive. So bishop takes h3 is perhaps the best way that Marshall can try to either equalize or give Capablanca a slight advantage, which he cannot really do anything with. But Marshall goes bishop to g4, and this is a big mistake. Why? Because now after h takes g4 is played by Capablanca, here Marshall kind of messed up. He should have went for the move bishop g3 or maybe even queen h1 check, although this position is already completely lost for Marshall. Best would have been bishop h2 check, king goes to f1, and then bishop g3, trying to infiltrate with the queen. So he does that, and now here Capablanca plays rook takes f2. Critical move. You need to remove that knight. It doesn't matter if you're going to be down material, because in this case, first of all, Capablanca isn't going to be down material. But secondly, he should not be worried about giving up material if his king is on the line. So queen to h1 check, king e2, and now bishop takes f2. And now we get to see why this d4 move was quite important. bishop d2. Now you might be thinking, how is this move very impressive? Well, it's not impressive in the sense that you just have gotten material, but it's impressive in the sense that now Capablanca can activate his pieces, and he won't be in as much trouble as he was in previous variations. So bishop h4, Marshall saves his bishop, otherwise it'll just be captured. So bishop h4, queen h3. Capablanca wants a trade of queens because it'll only favor him. He has extra material, because if you count the material, you can see that these two bishops cancel each other out, and so do these two rooks. And you're left with a rook versus a bishop and a knight. And also the queens cancel each other out as well. So you see that now if Capablanca were to trade the queens off, it would only benefit him instead of Marshall. So Marshall tries to activate as many pieces as he can. Rook e8 check, king d3, check on f1, king c2, and now bishop to f2. Definitely a better move could have been bishop to e1 or even queen to f2 to try at least increasing the pressure. But now Capablanca is already winning, so those moves really don't affect him at all. Bishop f2, queen f3 now, pinning the bishop to the queen. Queen g1, and here the move bishop d5 is played. What is this bishop d5 move trying to do? Well, it's trying to get this idea of king to b3, and then maybe a3, king a2, and then activating this knight on b1. It's a very clever idea that Capablanca has. c5 by Marshall, trying to strike, and he needs to strike quick, otherwise he can't do anything. So dc5, bishop c5, and now b4. Very good idea. b4 could also have been another plan with this bishop d5 move, and after b4, king goes to b2, knight gets developed, Marshall is lost. Bishop d6 is played now, and now a4. Capablanca definitely could have went king b2 and knight a3, but he decides to go a4 because it can develop his rook a lot quicker. a5, and now a takes b5, a takes b4, and now rook a6. He activates the rook, and soon enough, the knight. So bc3, knight c3, and now we see that Marshall is in trouble. Yes, it may seem like he's completely better, but that's just an illusion. Marshall is actually worse than Capablanca here, because Capablanca has activated all of his pieces, and Marshall is actually down material, because there's a bishop and a knight against a rook. So here bishop b4. Marshall tries his best to at least get rid of some active pieces. b6, now Capablanca is trying to push his pawn to get a passed pawn and also just to win the game. Bishop c3, h6, and now b7. And here, unfortunately for Marshall, in times where any player is under pressure, he makes a terrible mistake. He played the move rook to e3. And how does this lose? Well, that's what I'm leaving it up to you. How did Capablanca nicely punish Marshall's mistake here? Okay, so here Capablanca played the move bishop takes f7 check. And how is this winning? Well, because if you play rook takes f7 here, then just b8 queen. You just gave another queen for Capablanca, and after king h7, just simply a very nice tactical sequence. Rook h6 check. King takes h6, because if you take with the pawn, the rook falls, and that's checkmate. So after king takes h6, queen h8 check, king g5, queen to h5 check, and this is checkmate. So that doesn't work. So what if you don't capture the bishop, but instead you go king to h8? Well, then just rook takes h6, and this is checkmate because of the nice pin that this bishop on c3 is doing. Finally, if you go king to h7, then this will lose because after king to h7, just queen f5 check. And if the king goes to h8, you lose the pawn on h6, and if the pawn goes to g6, then a very nice double bishop combination where the bishops are just slicing both sides of the board, and it doesn't really seem like Marshall had anything to do to stop this idea. That is why after the move bishop takes f7 check was played, Marshall resigned the game, and a very brilliant victory for Jose Roel Capablanca. So I hope you all enjoyed the video, and if you have any suggestions or feedback for me, please let me know in the comments section, and stay tuned for more chess.